What's up, painting friends? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Stoof, and today we are going to create an acrylic painting landscape. This one was requested by one of my subscribers who also follows me on Instagram. We follow each other. If you want to check out my Instagram, you can look up Steph Moraca Fine Art. The person that requested this is a pretty awesome photographer, and his name is Doug White Photo Art, if you want to check out his Instagram too. I'm using acrylic paints today just so that I can finish this a little bit more quickly. The layering will take less time because the paint will dry faster using acrylic paints. If I were to use oil paints, I'd probably take a few days working on this, but since we're going to use acrylics, maybe we'll get it done in 1 or 2 hours. For our paints today, we have titanium white, yellow oxide, flesh tint, light blue violet or sky blue violet, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, burnt sienna, crimson, cadmium free red light, yellow azo, yellow oxide again or a yellow ochre. These two, one is a heavy bodied and one is a soft bodied paint, so one is thinner, but they both have the same amount of pigment in them. One just has a thinner consistency. This is burnt umber, this is black, phthalo green, sap green, and magenta. So, and most of these paints are my Liquitex soft-bodied paints, but you are welcome to use any brand you would like. We also have an 11-inch by 14-inch canvas panel today, a cup of water to clean off our brushes, and for our brushes, I have a handful here. I'm not sure if I will need all of these, but I have about a 3/4 inch flat tip brush there. We have an angled brush, we have another flat tip brush that's a little more frayed, it might help us with the plants in the foreground. This is a flat tip brush. This is a finer flat tip brush, it's number 2 is what it says on the brush. Here's a round tip brush, another round tip brush, and what used to be a flat tip brush, but is now a round tip brush. I also use these Viva paper towels because they're kind of more cloth-like, and they don't leave any residue on my brushes when I'm cleaning them. Just to keep things a little bit more accurate, I'm going to use a grid method here. Every 3.5 inches, I'm just going to put a little tick from left to right. And same thing from top to bottom. But in general, that's where we're at. Alright, so now I've got my little grid, just some dots put in there. That's kind of creating these little grid squares. You could do the lines all the way through if that makes it easier for you and you want to use the grid method. But it's a little bit less sloppy if you just do those dots, because then you don't have to paint over your lines too. Okay, so now we can see on my reference photo, we've got our mountains in the background. The mountains never go over this like halfway point between this top row. So I'm just gonna do like a really subtle little line there so I know that. There's one like kind of right in the middle here. Alright, so now we got the mountain roughly sketched out, just that outline of the tops of the mountains. Now at the base of the mountains, it looks like we've got some sand or like some sediment here that I want to paint in that too. Just get that border. And this is kind of right at or just slightly above my little grid tick there. Kind of starts to go down under it. There's a little more sediment that's a different color over here. Alright, and now I'm going to switch to just umber for my sketching color. Just to show that now we're kind of getting into the foreground. This stuff was in the background. And we've got a row of trees. Comes down like this. Using the grid method is really helpful to get your angles accurate. There's a little hill slope here. Goes right about through the center. Comes down right there. And kind of connects to this hill slope. Just keep watering down the paint so it can give me a nice smooth glide, even though these paints are already pretty thin consistency wise. And then down here we've got another slope. And there are trees on all of these. Brought this up just a hair too high. There we go. And we've got another one that's right here, and then right here. Connect those two. Got like a cluster of trees in here. And then in the background, let's go back to this tree line here. Got another, these two kind of merge together here. And then this hillside should be a little farther down actually. Just kind of goes like that. And there's another little hill like right in here. I guess it's a little farther down. Alright, so that's the basic sketch that we needed. We've got most of the lines in here now for the hillsides. We'll add the trees in later, but we can now get started with filling in some color in the painting. So we're going to start with this larger brush. I've got a larger flat tip brush. I'm going to take my white, my ultramarine blue with my light blue violet and some flesh tint. Also going to blend in a hair of black and oxide and some more white. Maybe a tad of magenta too. gonna blend in a little more white because it feels kind of dark. And I'm just gonna cover this whole top with this color. In the reference photo, the sky is really like ominous. We have lots of clouds. I don't know if I want to use that many clouds, but we're gonna do some clouds here. I'm just starting with like a more of a shadowy cloud color. Just going right down to the mountains where I sketched in the outline earlier. It's okay if you don't perfectly stay with your line here. We can paint over any mistakes we make or anything that we accidentally covered up. Okay, I'm going to throw that brush into the water, and I'm going to grab my round tip brush, and I'm going to take some white with a little bit of my oxide and magenta and a hint of phthalo. And we're just gonna, while this paint's still kind of wet, I'm just gonna start to like make some little circles with my flat tip brush, and we're gonna start to build in some clouds here. And because the layer under this is still wet, it's kind of blending into it. So we've got like these little highlights kind of fading away, blending into the shadows. Just keep going back and forth with your little circles there. And I'm just going to take the extra paint off the brush, swirl it around, very lightly pressing here to just get a quick soft blend. Still making little swirl patterns with the brush. And now we're going to start to fill in some base color for these mountains in the background. So we're going to take some phthalo blue with white, black, and crimson. Let's do more phthalo, more crimson. And a hint more black. And well, it's too dark. Gonna go back with our phthalo and crimson and white. Let's give this a try. That's much better. So I'm just taking the brush, creating a little bit of the rough edges I see in the mountain form here. Now I'm just trying to focus more on the angles of these mountains, making sure I get these painted accurately. And I'm going to blend a little bit more white and phthalo into the base here. Maybe a little more magenta too. So I just blended a little bit of phthalo, sap green, and crimson, and I want to darken up a couple things here. It's just a little darker near the top, so I wanted to add this phthalo blue, sap green, and crimson mixture at the tops and then kind of blend it back down. Then we're going to start to blend in some of these little features in the like little sediments and things like that. We can see it in the mountains. So I just mix some cadmium-free red and some yellow oxide and white. I'm gonna blend in a little bit of ultramarine blue too. Still using the same brush, and we can start to add a little something. All right, so that's a little bit too warm. So I'm gonna take a little magenta and white and a little more ultramarine, and we'll put that there. That's a little better. And just kind of a little bit lighter value too. Take a little light blue violet. Yeah, there we go. So just start to add a couple of these little features here where we have exposed sediment or rock. Alright, and now we can move a little bit closer, starting with the sands. I'm going to take my flesh tint, just blend that in with the color we already had, a little more white, maybe a hint of ochre, our oxide. Just make that a little bit lighter and more flesh tinty colored. Yeah, I'm liking that, okay. And we'll add this in, this whole section here. We've got our sand or sediment. It's a little bit darker right here. Kind of block this all in with this base color first. So we still had that bluish color in here. I'm sure if you see these up close, they probably have more yellow and ochres in them, but because these are so far in the distance, we kind of lose those colors and get more of the blues. Now I just blended a little bit of that mountain shadow color with umber and the stuff that was on my brush. And that's going to give me this little middle color here. Get a little more ultramarine. Add these shadows in between some of my little highlights I put in here too, so the highlights aren't like too prominent. There we go. And we can take a little more phthalo, a little magenta, and some white. And this is, let's do some brown too. This is like our color right here. Maybe a little bit of flesh tint too. carry that all the way, finish out the background, and then you can blend that color in to the base of your dunes, get like a little middle value. Then we need a little highlight on our dunes. I'm going to take flesh tint and white, a little bit of that oxide color, and there's still some blue on my brush. I didn't totally clean it off yet, so we've still got some cool in here. And I'm just going to take that brush, add highlights to a couple of the lines for the dunes. Get that triangle top. Back up and into shape here. Alright, and then we take a little more brown. Just gonna add a couple little shadows in the dunes. Looks good enough to me. I'm just gonna blend a little bit more of my blue right here. Just make that blue a little more saturated phthalo blue at the base of the dunes there. All right, and also want to add a little highlight right here too. Now we're good. Now let's start moving forward to these hills. All right, so I think for the hills, I'm going to start with the base, like grassy covered part of the hills, and then we'll add the tree line over top. And we're going to start with the ones in the background. So I'm going to take this oxide color with some white, some magenta, a little umber, and I'll do a little yellow azo. That's actually a little too warm, so let's take a little bit of light blue violet, blend that in with some white. Now you can see these two colors here. It's going to mix a little more brown into this one, and we're going to lighten it up a little more. Alright, now I'm liking that. And we're just going to fill in the lines here with our color. And then this one's a little closer, so for this one we can use that warmer color that I made. That's going to help to separate these two as well. Now let's take a little more white for this section right here. Got another one. Take a little more oxide. Blend it in with that first darker color. Put this one here. The yellows aren't as opaque as the other colors, so you may have to layer up a couple times if you can see that line underneath the paint. Mix a little bit of brown and a hint of black into this. We've got like a shadow coming down, maybe a little bit of ultramarine and magenta. And there's a shadow up here too. We'll use that same color. Just blend it while it's still wet and you'll get a smoother transition of color because you can just blend it with the other paint. And same thing back here. There's a shadow like right in here. Keeping them pretty subtle. It can get a little tricky in the dunes here. Just remember which one you're working on. If you don't get lost, if you know what hill you're working with, it's going to help you out a lot. If you get lost, you might put the wrong color or value in the wrong spot. Taking a little more oxide. For this here, we've only got a little bit of actual hillside exposed. The rest is covered in trees over here. Same thing up here. We do have more oxide up here in the color. And then let's take some flesh tint, oxide, and azo. Now things are starting to get nice and light up here. Kind of fades into the darker shadow color at the base, but the top part's pretty light. Can mix a little more magenta in the shadow color, magenta and oxide. And I want to take this highlight color over here too, because it is lighter at the top of this one. Taking the extra paint off my brush and just letting this blend. All right, moving back over here. Got this nice highlight again. Take a little more yellow oxide. And we got the shadowy color a little more down here. Now we're going to take more white and some oxide. Let's do a little bit of umber and azo. And we take a little more oxide and umber, and let's do a little bit of light blue violet and a little bit magenta. And a little more oxide. And this one we've just got like a buildup of shadows, kind of might be patches of burnt grass or just shadows from something. Take more umber and magenta. Just going back and forth with the brush, pushing it in different directions so I can get the more of the slope look here. So our slope kind of comes like this down. So by doing that angle with my brush, I'm helping to build that slope to look more realistic. And then we've got this big cluster of trees in there. Got some shadows in here behind this tree cluster. And we've got our nice highlight color again up here with the flesh tint and azo, or flesh tint and oxide. Just gonna take some white and add a tiny hair of light blue violet. Cool this down a little bit. Now our slope is coming down like this, so that's the way I'm carrying the brush stroke. Mix a little more umber, ultramarine in here. A little bit of black and brown for this section going into the trees. It's in shadow. Building up the shadow a little more down here. Mix a little bit cooler colors in there. Going back to my yellow and oxide and flesh tint. Alright, and I'm just going to clean off this brush because this next hill is like in full highlight. White, oxide, azo, and flesh tint. Start to blend in a little bit more of the shadowy colors along the sides. We can include a little more magenta and azo, but don't go crazy with the azo like I just did there. And this is mostly covered with trees down here. And just peek a little bit of, just a little bit of this peeking through. And then this one down here has got more magenta in it. Even more. Magenta and umber there. A little bit more white. So now we have a basic idea of how the hills are sloped and kind of where the highlights and shadows are, just roughly painted in. Now we're going to start to add some trees, and then we can make adjustments to some of the highlights and the shadows on the hills here. All right, let's start with this number 2 flat tip brush here. We're going to start to add some trees. So we got some sap green, some ultramarine blue, a little bit of red, and let's do some crimson and phthalo blue and some phthalo green, magenta. All right, so back here we've just got some random little clusters. They aren't sticking to only the top edge of the hillside. They kind of go onto the hill in different sections here, so don't just put them perfectly at the top of each ridge line if you're recreating this one. And they're a little smaller in this hillside in the far background. Basically just blocking in shapes for all these little trees right now. Not going too crazy with any highlights or shadows just quite yet. Let's do phthalo and crimson here. Got a nice tree line right along this ridge. And the ridge behind it. And if you're starting to get lost on your trees, well, first of all, you don't have to make your trees look exactly like they look in the picture, because as long as you get like a basic shape right, then they're gonna look like trees. But if you do want to match your tree line up with how it looks in the picture, then just look at the mountain ridge and where you are in the mountain ridge with your trees, and that's how you can line it up. Just make sure it's like, okay, I'm at this peak here, this big tree's right here. And there's a little nook where there's a nook there, and then it comes back up. And then the top of this one is right before that peak. And over here, I've got more trees. So we've got 1, 2, 3 ridges here. I'm just gonna adjust this ridge a little bit. And this one you can kind of see through the trees a little more. So I'm just kind of pushing that paint around, but leaving a little bit visible, a little bit of the dune or the hillside behind it. And we've got these bushes and trees kind of wrapping over the top here. And if you want to go into more detail with all of this, you can. You just would use a liner brush to get the detail in all these little trees. But here we're basically just putting trees everywhere that we see trees in the reference photo. Just blocking in some base color and shapes. And then we can go back and start to add more highlights and other features. And some up here. These ones are a little bit less dark. Let's take a little ultramarine. These are just more like little tiny bushes and plants. And the angle that you put these brush strokes will help to create your hill slope here, so keep that in mind. All right, and then we've got more sap green and black. And here, these trees kind of stay along that ridge. Come in a little bit. All right, so now we blocked in the base colors for the trees. Get this little brush and we're gonna grab some white with a little flesh tint. Do a tiny bit of light blue violet. Maybe a tiny bit of oxide. And we can start to build up more little highlights. Just making little swirls, very lightly pressing the canvas. And then we can take a little bit more of our light blue violet, maybe a little black, flesh tint, more ultramarine blue, hint of magenta in there too maybe. And we can build up a little bit of a shadow. And I keep adding a little bit more white and blending in closer to that other color to give myself a little transition between highlight and shadow. The key to making nice realistic clouds is blending. Which is trickier for me to do with acrylic paint, not gonna lie. I enjoy painting clouds with oil paint much more than acrylic paint now. Because oil paint takes longer to dry, so you get more blending time. So I'm just making swirly back and forth brush strokes here to add a few more little highlights in these clouds, get a few more shadows built into. Just kind of putting some shadows and highlights all over in the sky, building up that depth of cloud that we have. Just gotta touch up our mountains again a little bit at the tops where I covered it up just a little. Looking good. All right, I'm happy with the sky. It's kind of got that ominous feel. And the background here is pretty much good. Now let's do a little more with the highlights in the hillside. Gonna take a little more oxide, white, flesh tint, a little umber. And I'm going to switch to my flat tip brush that's a little larger. Do like a tiny hint of azo, but not too much. This one's super bright right here. And I'm just very lightly pressing the brush down to get a little bit more highlights, the ridges. Got another one right back here, a little highlight. Another one kind of in here. And I'm going to take a little bit more, just a little bit of that light blue violet now for these highlights back in here. Maybe a little more yellow azo. And oxide. And it's okay if you go over your trees a little bit, because we're going to come back to those later. Gonna mix some more of our oxide in there with a little umber and some magenta. Ooh, that's way too warm. Let's mix in some light blue violet. All right, that's a little better. Just very lightly pressing, trying to get a little bit of this warmer color in here, but without too much. Same with this one, got more of that color in here. Got some brown, kind of making its way, just dry brush it, so just like very lightly press and don't have too much paint on your brush. It'll catch the little bits of canvas and give you that textured look. Same with this down here and right here. So I don't have a whole lot of paint on my brush. I'm just kind of pushing the brush around. I'll take a little bit of sap green, black, and umber and oxide, and add some color there. I'll add some azo and white. Just kind of like a lighter green here. Did umber with a little bit of ultramarine there. Let's get some more umber. And maybe a little crimson for right here. Starts to get pretty dark. And we'll mix some oxide and white in to blend that into more of this highlight color. And then come back to the shadowy color. Just kind of dry brushing it around again. Keeping it dark down here. One more ultramarine blue with umber down here. It's pretty dark. And then we'll take a little bit of our magenta and burnt sienna for more of the shadows on this one. That's a little too dark. Flesh tint and oxide and some sienna. Add a couple little highlights in here again too. Alright, these hills look pretty good. Let me do a little highlight back here, just add a little oxide. Got this one there, that one, that one. This one right there. Add a little more. A little more of our shadows in here. Alright, good enough. Alright, now I want to add some more to the trees. So I'm going to take my phthalo green and white and black and crimson. And let's try that as like a highlight color. So I'm going to fray the brush a little more and just kind of start to add some little highlights. It's very, very lightly pressing and letting it create like brush tree limb highlights here. We can add a little more brown and green to these ones. All right, and then for some of these other ones, we're gonna mix phthalo green with azo, burnt sienna, some phthalo blue, a little bit of red. And we'll add some white. So these are a little warmer. Can add a little more white. Use this for highlights back here. So I'm just adding random highlights and Not letting the highlights completely cover everything, just kind of starting to go over the tops of each little tree, the top and the right side. And these ones in the background are going to have a little more blue, a little more ultramarine, maybe light blue violet. Mixing my phthalo green with some umber and ultramarine blue. Trying to make some more subtle highlights in the background here. Letting my little brush just kind of move all over. There's not a whole lot of contrast back here. These trees are just kind of dark. Alright, those feel pretty good. I'm gonna build up some shadows on some of these just while I'm working back here. I'm mixing black with my phthalo green and my sap green. And you know, we're going to mix a little bit of light blue violet in there too, so it's not too dark. And just add little shadows at the base. So we're just kind of layering up the highlights and then the shadows again. Trying to help this to read a little less flat. And in here too, take a little phthalo blue. Just while we're here, we'll build up some shadows. Alright, and now for the trees in the foreground, it's just white with little oxide and sap green and a little bit of our light blue violet, maybe a little bit of magenta too. And these ones we can see a little bit more of the branches. We've got more contrast here between light and dark because this is the closest thing in the foreground here. Different highlights in here too, so I just mixed a little bit more of light blue violet and some white in here. Let's mix a little more sap green and yellow azo. And I'm just adding these like in random little places around here. A little more ultramarine blue. These highlights are just kind of creating clusters, and you see it kind of starts to form a bunch of little trees. All right, and we do have some shadows visible on the ground here. I'm going to mix my burnt sienna with some light blue violet and my other two blues, and a little more phthalo. Yeah, that's pretty good. And we're just going to add these. Maybe we'll add a little more umber there. Just going to add some little shadows. They're kind of to the left a little bit of these trees. And you can see a little bit of these shadows back here too. Let me make them a little bit lighter for back here. You can't really tell if it's leaves on a tree or a shadow on the ground once you get past this area here. So just add some little highlights on there. All right, I am going to use my small brush, and we're going to add some of the trees. So I'm mixing black, brown, and blue, and a little bit of magenta. I'm just dipping this in the water to thin the paint down a little bit. It's starting to get a little bit thicker because it's kind of drying. All right, so you just take your brush and you just create a bunch of little limbs off of this main tree here. Then you can take your little brush, very lightly press, and you can start to create just like little scribbles, like making little star shapes or something like that, and that will help to create your little limbs coming off there. And if you thin your paint down, mix a little bit of white into that, a little brown maybe. There's a little less contrast. Alrighty, and then I'm going to take a little highlight for those and mix some white with my ochre and my umber and my light blue violet, and we're just going to kind of scribble around some little highlights in here too. Doesn't have to be perfect. Alright, now we can go back to our small brush, and I'm going to add another round of highlights on these trees in the foreground. So I'm just going to mix some white into my oxide and sap green. Going to mix more sap green. I'll mix a little yellow azo in there. And some magenta because that yellow is too yellow. Let's get a little more white. All right, now basically over your little highlights, you're going to add another round of highlights that covers even less of your current highlight. And just adjusting my trees so they're still kind of in front of everything. Well, the ones that are in front of everything. You don't have to make them all be in front of everything. Just adding a little highlight to some of the sides of the trees, just so it looks less flat. And then we'll add another bit of highlight with magenta, oxide, and burnt sienna. A little more magenta. Because it is much like warmer and pinker in the foreground here. Can mix some more white. And then I want a more defined edge right here, I think. So I'm gonna take my umber, a little bit of blue, and we're just gonna do that. And then we're gonna touch that up. I'm gonna take some magenta, umber, oxide, and just blend this up in to this. Softly. And adding some like warmer shadowy colors in here too, with like the browns and magentas, a little crimson. Alright guys, we're gonna call that a finished painting. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed this painting tutorial. If you guys have requests for painting tutorials you would like to see, then you can leave a comment under this video, or you can follow me on Instagram. Steph Moraca Fine Art is my profile, and you can send me an image if you would like me to try to turn that into a painting tutorial. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and happy painting! Bye bye!